November 1944. An infantry regiment sits entrenched near the frozen banks of the Saar River. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. Inside a command post, a young chaplain places a typed report on a mahogany desk. It is a document of human collapse. He speaks of men who have forgotten how to eat. He speaks of soldiers who stare at the horizon with eyes that no longer see. He warns that a breaking point has been reached and recommends a 48-hour rotation to a rest area. The colonel picks up the paper, his face a mask of irritation. He does not read the data. He does not look at the suicide counts. With two slow, deliberate movements, he tears the report into 4 pieces and drops them into a wastebasket. He says the men will hold because he ordered them to hold. It is a moment where pride becomes a death sentence. General Patton is about to show this commander that ignoring the soul of an army is the fastest way to lose its strength. This is the story of a commander who thought psychological fatigue was a myth, and the general who proved him wrong by listening to the one man he tried to silence. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth behind the myths of military glory. By joining us, you help preserve the lessons of those moments that forced people to face what they had done. Captain Michael Donnelly was 35 years old and came from a working-class neighborhood in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Before the war, he had been a parish priest who spent his Sundays listening to the quiet confessions of dock workers and shopkeepers. He had enlisted because he believed that in the middle of a slaughterhouse, someone needed to remember the names of the dead. He served as the regimental chaplain for the infantry units currently digging into the frozen mud of the Saar region. Donnelly was a man who did not hide in the rear. He carried a heavy burden that had nothing to do with ammunition or steel. He had spent 3 years witnessing the slow erosion of the human spirit. He had held the hands of 19-year-old boys who cried for mothers they would never see again. His boots were perpetually caked in the gray slush of the front lines, and his own hands often shook from the cold, but his mind remained sharp. He was a man of quiet observation. He saw the way a soldier's eyes went flat when the soul decided it had seen enough. He had watched 3 of his boys take their own lives in the span of a single month because the silence of the woods became more terrifying than the sound of the guns. He was the only man in the regiment who truly knew the cost of every yard gained. Colonel Walter Bradshaw was 50 years old, born and bred in the affluent circles of Kansas City, Missouri. He was a man who believed that leadership was a matter of mathematics and iron will. To Bradshaw, an infantry battalion was a machine, and if a machine stopped working, it was simply because the operator was not being firm enough. He kept his uniform meticulously pressed even in the field, and his command post was always situated well behind the reach of enemy mortars. He had not set foot in the forward foxholes for over 3 weeks, preferring the clean lines of his staff maps to the messy reality of the trenches. Bradshaw viewed the very concept of combat exhaustion as a moral failing rather than a physiological reality. He often told his officers that a man only broke if he was allowed to think he had the option to break. To him, the chaplain's role was to provide a veneer of tradition and a few words over a grave, not to interfere with the tactical disposition of troops. He viewed the suffering of his men through a lens of unearned privilege, convinced that his own comfort was a result of his superior character. He believed that grit could be summoned by an order, and he saw Donnelly's clinical reports as nothing more than weakness documented on paper. By November 1944, the optimism that had followed the breakout from Normandy was gone. The Allied advance had slowed to a grueling crawl against a German defense that was stiffening as the front approached the Rhine. In the Saar region, the weather had become as much of an enemy as the German 88s. The ground was a soup of freezing mud and jagged ice. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, leaving many frontline units without dry socks, let alone the hot rations needed to sustain a man in a foxhole for weeks on end. Across the European theater, the U.S. Army was facing a silent crisis that many high-ranking officers were ill-equipped to handle. It was the crisis of human endurance. Combat exhaustion was not yet fully understood as a physiological reality of prolonged stress. Instead, it was often dismissed by the old guard as a lack of discipline or a failure of the American spirit. Thousands of men were being pushed past the limits of what the biological system can withstand. In many regiments, Replacement soldiers were being fed into the meat grinder, only to break within 48 hours because the veterans they joined were already ghosts. Command structures were fracturing under the weight of sustained attrition. Many colonels, safe in heated chateau basements miles behind the lines, continued to issue orders based on map symbols rather than the shivering, hollowed-out men those symbols represented. They viewed the mounting reports of shell shock and battle fatigue with suspicion, fearing that admitting to these conditions would reflect poorly on their own leadership. This atmosphere of denial created a dangerous vacuum where the health of the troops was sacrificed for the vanity of the command. The situation near the Saar River was a powder keg of resentment and despair. It was only a matter of time before the pressure forced a total collapse. The scene was set for a confrontation that would determine if the army belonged to its men or its maps. Captain Donnelly stood in the center of the command post, his damp wool coat smelling of the frozen Saar mud. He looked at the torn scraps of his report in the wastebasket. Beside him stood Major Thomas Halloway, the regimental executive officer, a 40-year-old career soldier from Richmond, Virginia. Halloway had seen the report. He had seen the suicide numbers. He looked at the chaplain, then at the colonel who was currently buffing a scuff off his polished boot. Halloway cleared his throat. He asked the colonel if he had truly considered the implications of the rising exhaustion rates. He noted that the 2nd Battalion was operating at 40% of its effective strength. Bradshaw did not look up from his boot. He told the major that 40% of a determined American battalion was worth 3 divisions of conscripts. Donnelly stepped forward. He said that the men were not just tired, but that they were losing the will to survive. He mentioned the 3 men who had used their own rifles to end their misery in the last month. Bradshaw finally looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive. He told the chaplain that those men were cowards who had found an easy way out of their duty. He said that prayer was for the pews, not for the tactical planning of an infantry regiment. Halloway tried again, citing the field manual on troop welfare and the necessity of rotation to maintain combat integrity. Bradshaw stood up and slammed his hand on the mahogany desk. He told them both that he was the commander of this regiment, and he would decide when a man was too tired to fight. He said that if he admitted the men were exhausted, he was admitting he had failed to train them. He told Donnelly that if he spent less time coddling the men and more time preaching about the glory of sacrifice, the suicide rate might actually go down. The room went silent. The tension was broken by a frantic radio operator in the corner. The man turned, his headset hanging around his neck. He reported that the lead platoon of the 2nd Battalion had just received the order to advance on the ridge. They hadn't moved. The lieutenant in charge had reported back that his men were sitting in their holes and would not get out. It was the first combat refusal in the history of the regiment. Bradshaw's face turned a deep, mottled red. He shouted into the room that he wanted every man in that platoon arrested for mutiny. He said he would line them up and shoot them himself if he had to. Halloway looked at Donnelly, then back at his commander. He realized the situation had spiraled beyond the walls of this office. He walked to the secure line and placed a call to 3rd Army headquarters. He told the duty officer that a regimental command had suffered a total breakdown in discipline following a disregarded morale warning. The report reached Patton within the hour. The silence in the command post was broken by the low, distinctive rumble of a modified Willys Jeep. It pulled to a halt directly outside the door, the engine cutting out with a sharp, metallic snap. No one moved until the door swung open and George S. Patton stepped into the room. He was a vision of iron discipline in the flickering lantern light, his uniform perfectly tailored, his helmet reflecting the dim glow with a high polish that seemed impossible given the Saar mud outside. The 4 silver stars on his shoulders caught the light, but it was the ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist that drew every eye. He did not say a word as he walked to the center of the room. He didn't have to. The air seemed to leave the lungs of every officer present. Patton stopped 3 feet from Colonel Bradshaw and simply stared. Patton's voice was surprisingly quiet when he finally spoke. He asked the colonel if it was true that a platoon had refused to advance. Bradshaw straightened his back and confirmed it, adding that the men were being processed for a court-martial. Patton then asked if the colonel had received a written warning about the battalion's condition prior to this morning. Bradshaw hesitated, then admitted he had seen a report from the chaplain. Patton leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. He asked where that report was now. Bradshaw glanced toward the wastebasket and stated that he had disposed of it because it was tactical nonsense written by a non-combatant. Patton asked the colonel one final question. When was the last time he had walked the line of the battalion in question? Bradshaw went silent for a 3-second beat before admitting it had been nearly 3 weeks. Patton looked at the floor, then back at the colonel. He told Bradshaw that a commander's first duty is to know the condition of his tools, and in the infantry, those tools are the hearts of men. He said that a chaplain does not look at maps. He looks at eyes, and eyes do not lie about when the soul has been hollowed out. Patton noted that while the colonel was busy keeping his boots clean in a heated office, his men were freezing in the mud until they preferred a firing squad to another hour in the line. He pointed to the scraps of paper in the bin and said that those fragments were the heartbeat of the regiment, and Bradshaw had stepped on them. Patton stated that combat exhaustion is a physical reality as real as a broken axle, and a man who ignores it is as incompetent as a mechanic who ignores a smoking engine. He told Bradshaw that he had a choice. He could either admit his failure and personally oversee the immediate relief of his men, or he could stand trial for criminal negligence in the face of the enemy. Patton did not wait for a long answer. He told the colonel that since he believed his men were so tough, he would now join them on their walk back to the rear, carrying the gear of the youngest private in the platoon. Bradshaw's face went white. He stood paralyzed as the reality of his relief from command settled over the room like a shroud. Patton turned his back on him. The conversation finished. The punishment was swift, public, and designed to humiliate the man who had traded the lives of his soldiers for the neatness of his records. Patton ordered the immediate relief of Colonel Bradshaw in front of his entire staff and the remaining officers of the regiment. As the winter sun hung low over the Saar River, Bradshaw was stripped of his command. He was forced to hand over his sidearm and his maps to Major Halloway, but Patton's justice went further than a mere dismissal. He ordered Bradshaw to walk the 3 miles to the battalion's forward positions on foot, through the freezing slush that he had refused to visit for weeks. Once there, he was made to apologize to the very men he had intended to court-martial. The soldiers watched in a heavy, stunned silence as the once immaculate colonel stood in the mud, his polished boots ruined, and his face red with shame, stuttering an admission that he had failed them. The men of the platoon were not punished. Instead, they were loaded onto trucks for their 48 hours of rest. They watched from the tailgates as their former commander was marched to the rear under guard, carrying the heavy rucksack of a private who had been pushed to the edge of death. It was a physical reversal of the weight of command. Every man in the regiment saw that while the soldiers were expected to endure the war, their leaders were expected to endure the truth. Michael Donnelly returned to Philadelphia after the war and served his parish for another 40 years. He never spoke of the medal he received for his service, but he kept a carbon copy of that torn-up report in a frame above his desk until the day he died in 1986. He often told his grandchildren that the most important thing a man can do is speak the truth when the powerful refuse to hear it. He remained a quiet advocate for veteran mental health, long before the term was widely understood by the public. Walter Bradshaw was never given another combat command. He was shuffled to a training post in the States, where he finished the war in administrative obscurity. He retired in 1948 and moved back to Missouri, where he spent his final years writing letters to military journals, claiming that the softening of the American soldier would be the ruin of the country. He died in 1972, still bitter. Over the day, his polished boots were ruined in the Saar mud. Patton himself mentioned the incident only once in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote that he had encountered a commander who thought his men were made of wood and stone. He noted that the chaplain was the only man in the regiment who actually understood that an army is a living thing that requires more than just fuel and ammunition to keep moving forward. Some historians argue that Patton's intervention was a breach of the military chain of command that undermined the authority of a regimental officer during a critical offensive. They suggest that by siding with the chaplain and the refusing platoon, Patton risked encouraging further insubordination across the Third Army. Other historians argue that this moment was a masterpiece of leadership that recognized the biological limits of the human soldier. They contend that Patton understood that morale is a finite resource, and that a commander who ignores the mental health of his troops is more dangerous than any enemy. What is certain is that after the incidents in the Saar, the status of Chaplain morale reports was permanently elevated. They were no longer viewed as optional religious observations, but as vital intelligence regarding the combat readiness of the American fighting man. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply reassigned the commander to a desk job without the public walk of shame? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.